Welcome to Moneyweb at Midday, the actuality news show, offering unique insights and in-depth analysis, featuring South Africa's top business leaders, newsmakers, and analysts for today's professionals. Your host, Jeremy Maggs.
Hello, and thank you for listening to Moneyweb at Midday. In the next 30 minutes, I'll put some context around the numbers, perspective around the politics, and clarity around the choices facing us in South Africa. A warm welcome at the start of the week. I'm Jeremy Maggs. Coming up on the program today, government and business are betting on faster growth and 1 million new jobs, but can they finally deliver? South Africa takes the driver's seat in global heavy haul rail as Transnet tries to rebuild the network at home. Doing the right thing can be deadly when standing up to corruption, putting lives on the line. And small businesses are winning the contracts but still going broke, exposing the cracks in supplier development. It's Monday, the 24th of August. Government and business have set themselves a formidable new target: get South Africa growing at more than 3% and help create 1 million additional jobs by 2030. That is just around the corner. But with unemployment at just over 33% and growth still nowhere near that level, one's got to ask if this is a credible plan or just an ambitious promise. Martin Kingston is chair of the Business for South Africa Steering Committee and joins me now to talk about Phase 3 of the big partnership to unlock growth, jobs and confidence. Martin, welcome to you. And why should South Africans believe that 1 million new jobs by 2030 is actually achievable?
Well, good day to you, Jeremy, and your listeners. It is achievable, and we know that it's achievable if we get the right level of growth into the system. What we also know is that anything less than 3% growth per annum, we see our levels of unemployment in the country increasing. We have obviously unacceptable levels of unemployment and very worrying and anemic levels of growth. So what we've looked at in the context of Phase 3 is what do we need to do to actually drive growth in areas that both contribute meaningfully to economic growth on the one hand and to employment and inclusion on the other hand. And those are the 4 new areas that we've identified, all of which, by the way, are within our own control, Jeremy. They're not subject to exogenous factors. We have the levers internally to deal with them if we've got both the political will on the one hand and the capacity and the expertise within the country at large, and specifically the corporate sector on the other hand.
So let's look at those levers. Phase 3 adds mining, tourism, infrastructure and agriculture. Martin, which of those sectors do you think stands to deliver most optimally? Because the potential in all of this has been spoken about for years with little result.
Yeah, so I think in every single one of them, we did very detailed work to analyze where the unlock could take place, how significant it could be. As in phases 1 and 2, we're committed to not only quantifying, but actually being very precise and specific about the progress we need to make, reporting back on a transparent and regular basis. If we look, for example, at the agricultural and agro-processing sector, we already have 1.5 million employees in the industry, some 4 to 7 dependents supported by each agricultural job. We've identified 4 specific interventions. One, the Port of Cape Town. We know that that's very problematic during the summer season if the right interventions don't take place. That really requires a short-term embedded resource. That's all. We think that could unlock 5 billion rands worth of exports. Expanded access to export markets. Land reform, which you'll say, Jeremy, and rightly so, has been on the agenda for a long time. It should be absolutely possible to accelerate title deed transfer and agro-processing, where we can look at import substitution. We think we could create 100,000 new jobs in the next 12 months alone, simply in that area alone. Similarly, if we look, for example, at infrastructure, we know very well that infrastructure is a huge driver both of growth and employment, but we need to have a better coordinated, better organized and integrated approach. Again, not just mobilizing capital, but skills and expertise from the private sector, as we've done for energy, transport and logistics, and the other areas we've looked at so far.
If you look at phase 3 holistically or collectively, Martin, what is the single biggest constraint, do you think, stopping those sectors from investing and hiring?
Well, I believe that there are sort of two, to be honest. I mean, we had originally found that the constraints were energy and transport and logistics. To a significant extent, of course, that's been addressed. That doesn't mean there's ongoing work that needs to take place. Maintaining structural reform is at the heart of this. Operation Vulindlela is focused on that, and we're leaning in to help where that's appropriate. Having the requisite capacity, particularly within the state, the necessary skills and capabilities to look at very clear and laser-focused interventions. And then finally, and this won't surprise you, Jeremy, having the political will to take difficult decisions. And that needs to be not just those decisions that have to be taken, but then implemented. Implementation actually is a less challenging hurdle, I think, than the political courage to take those decisions currently.
Martin, all of this depends on a working cooperative relationship with government, but business would concede surely that government itself is still responsible for many of those constraints. Regulation, failing municipalities, we can get to that in just a moment, particularly as far as Johannesburg is concerned, infrastructure and policy uncertainty, which in many respects is driven by that lack of political will that you referenced.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And we are very mindful of the fact, Jeremy, that we're not going to stray outside the boundaries of what is possible and appropriate. And government does have the both responsibility and the authority to take those decisions and to implement both with respect to regulation and policy to hold people to account when they're not performing. And those are all areas where we need to see an acceleration of both commitment and action that applies equally in the area of what we've characterized as confidence multipliers. So crime and corruption, if we don't deal with it, we won't see investment. Investment is going to drive growth. Growth is going to drive jobs. And that investment is not going to take place if we don't have the right confidence in the system. And as you say, that is a political set of decisions. We have had, I think, very open and honest discussions with government. The president, as you know, chairs the partnership. We have ministerial level support and involvement in all of the areas concerned. And I believe that we have made enormous progress over the past 3 years in the context of the partnership in its current shape, size and form. But maintaining that impetus, particularly with the upcoming local government elections, I'm sure you'll come to that, is problematic. That is a very significant headwind. What I do want to emphasize, though, is that we have it within our own control as a country to address these issues. This is not subject to exogenous factors or shocks to the system at all.
But it does suggest that business can't really fix much without government first fixing the machinery of state.
Well, we can't fix much without government being prepared to do so. We can do much of this work, in parallel. I think we've seen a significant progress in energy, significant progress in transport and logistics, even in the apparatus to deal with crime and corruption. At the end of the day, the establishment of the National Energy Crisis Committee or the National Logistics Crisis Committee or the Madlanga Commission, those all fall to government. We take some comfort from the fact that those structures were established, that we're invited to participate wherever is possible and appropriate. We capacitate them through the Resource Mobilization Fund, albeit at arm's length. I think we're making real progress relative to 3 or 4 years ago. But as we said before, Jeremy, it's not fast enough and it's not deep enough to make the difference that is required if we're going to lift growth levels above what we're seeing at the moment being forecast by National Treasury.
And now to the November poll. In conclusion, the partnership includes Johannesburg and local government, Martin. Does that amount to an admission that municipal failure has now become a national economic constraint?
We think it's an absolute economic constraint. Indeed, we think that the city of Johannesburg, on its current trajectory, is undermining all the efforts at a national level, not just in terms of optics, but in terms of substance, given the very significant contribution that Johannesburg makes both to GDP, 15-16%, to the number of companies that are headquartered or based in Johannesburg, as an indication of whether or not we have the capacity as a country to govern our leading municipalities. And there's no doubt that it has failed, and we have said so publicly as well as directly to government. But what we've also indicated, Jeremy, is that we're not prepared to get involved in leaning into the city of Johannesburg unless and until such time as we have a competent, credible and appropriate counterparty that has the requisite authority to take the necessary actions, and that currently is manifestly not the case. In the meanwhile, we've appointed CEO sponsors, as we call them, for all of these areas, including with respect to the city of Johannesburg, and we are in discussions about how we can mobilize post the local government elections. We're not going to get involved, as I indicated, before we've seen the outcome of that process.
Martin Kingston, thank you very much indeed.
Moneyweb at midday for all your up-to-date stories.
South Africa is trying to fundamentally remake its freight rail system, repairing an aging network while opening the tracks to private operators and private investment. At the center of that reform is Transnet Rail Infrastructure Manager, or TRIM, and Nkululeko Gobozi is TRIM's Chief Engineer of Technology Management and also the newly elected chair of the International Heavy Haul Association. So let's get into the weeds of this debate and a very important job. And Nkululeko, welcome to you. Is TRIM genuinely capable of rebuilding South Africa's rail network while at the same time opening it up to private competition? There must be a lot of logistical conflict, surely, in that exercise.
One can confidently say we are more than capable and we are executing on that mandate. It's just a matter of meeting the timelines that we have committed to do, which we are very confident we should be able to.
How much of the problem is simply the physical condition of the infrastructure after years of underinvestment and neglect? Is that the biggest issue that you're dealing with right now?
Sure, one could say that. However, the reason for it, I would not necessarily limit to years of maybe underinvestment. There are several external factors that have not always been the case, and those factors, I think, have exacerbated what we are seeing as the effect in operational efficiency. And just to mention one, it is the sabotage, because I think if you just put it as theft and vandalism, one does not appreciate the gravity of what we are faced with. So I'd say the sabotage of railway infrastructure has played a massive role in that it undermines the efforts for us to revitalize the network and the timelines that we've committed. But moreover, it just makes it worse in areas where we did not prioritize the recovery programs on. So sure, there are areas where we are recovering and covering the backlog, if I may, of the underinvestment in maintenance, but there is significant amount of theft and vandalism and sabotage of rail infrastructure that we are looking at new innovative strategies to address. I can't share the detail of a lot of those, but that has certainly undermined a lot of the work that we are trying to do. And with industry support, TMSA, we are identifying new opportunities to address that.
So, Nkululeko, all predicated, of course, on whether you have enough money to rehabilitate and maintain the network at the pace that the economy requires.
Sure. I think it's a good problem to have that we haven't had before, where we have access to funding that demands our execution within a specific timeline. For a while, that has been the challenge that Transnet has been faced with in trying to get access to funding. But now, I think with the vertical separation of the ODs, there's a lot of interest in funding the capital investment in infrastructure. And with that, there is opportunities that we are exploring internally in inviting industry to participate in the execution within the timelines that we've committed to. It's not only now important to our immediate shareholders, but to the stakeholders that are also providing that funding. So we are introducing new mechanism to support in the execution of the programs. That bit, we should be approaching the market or communicating that approach to the market to then onboard that support in the manner that we are looking to get that support.
And in that respect, 11 private train operators have already cleared the initial hurdle for network access, which is good news. What has got to happen, though, before that translates into significantly more freight actually moving by rail?
The process is largely governed by the Railway Safety Regulator permits. And as TRIM, there's obviously the technical support in ensuring that the rolling stock that is introduced onto our network complies with the infrastructure requirements, and that work is underway. There's a lot actually that has already taken place, and there's a lot of continuing support, engineering support to enable the operators to be able to expedite their own commitments. So the RSR, or Railway Safety Regulator, being the primary owner, I'd say, of those standards or permit issuing, is in the forefront, and then all stakeholders, us and the TOCs, are supporting in the enablement of that in the short term. So that work is happening, and once that is done, there's obviously interface agreements happening between TRIM as the infrastructure manager and those TOCs, and that work through our commercial frameworks, that is being expedited as well. And as it stands, we actually have weekly, well, as it seems like it's daily engagement with the TOCs to ensure that we handle whatever challenges they might have in coming on board as soon as possible.
But it is a fine balancing act, because putting additional operators onto a constrained network does risk surely creating congestion rather than efficiency unless the infrastructure improves first.
Yes, one could look at it that way. However, it would be a one-dimensional view, in that some of the constraints, at least in meeting the volume targets as a country, are not limited. If one looks at the state of the entire country network, it is not the entire country network that has experienced some of those constraints. Sure, one could say in specific corridors there is that constrained infrastructure capability. However, in some of the instances, it is also on the rolling stock where the opportunity for the additional TOCs come into play, in that where the constraints would have been because of funding or availability of rolling stock, then the additional TOCs are well primed to be able to increase availability of in-country rolling stock and train capability to meet the additional targets. I think there is earmarked about 20 million tons in the short term that should be brought in by the additional TOC. So notwithstanding the ability of the infrastructure to support that additional capacity, there is definitely an opportunity for that additional capacity on its own to perhaps go beyond some of the constraints that have been with the operating company or the TFR leg of the business.
And just a final question and a quick answer, please. You're also looking for private partners to revive neglected branch lines on the so-called B network. And Nkululeko, if some of those lines haven't been commercially viable for years, why will private capital make them viable now?
Sure. Well, one would have to look at the mandate of Transnet, essentially, in why, if one says not necessarily viable. So one would imagine that possibly there is a different value proposition that private sector is able to apply on those specific lines that would not necessarily have been aligned with the strategic view of what Transnet is trying to achieve or aligned with the stakeholders. So those become, I would make an example, tourism is a big sector. It might be, tourism, small-scale passenger commute effectively on those lines, and further, many other non-core business pursuits by Transnet, which could be of value to PSP. So that's just an example, and we are seeing a lot of those opportunities play out. Some have already been exploited, and Western Cape is doing quite a brilliant job in bringing in tourism in some of those lines. So there are further opportunities like that are worth exploring.
Nkululeko Gobozi, thank you very much indeed. You are Chief Engineer of Technology Management and the newly elected Chair of the International Heavy Haul Association from TRIM, Transnet's Rail Infrastructure Manager. I do appreciate your time. Think you found the perfect investment? Let's check. Join Moneyweb editor Ryk van Niekerk at the Money Summit, where he'll reveal the warning signs of today's biggest investment scams, from fake trading platforms to promises of guaranteed returns. Learn how to protect your money before it's too late. Tuesday, the 1st of September at the Sandton Convention Centre. Register for free using the promo code MONEYWEB. Visit moneyweb.co.za and secure your seat today.
You're listening to Moneyweb at Midday.
South Africa asks professionals time and time again to expose corruption, refuse dodgy deals and uphold ethical standards. But increasingly, I think, doing exactly that can carry a frightening personal cost, and that has been so well documented. Officials, investigators and professionals linked to corruption probes have been threatened and in some cases have been murdered, while many whistleblowers say the fear of retaliation is enormous. I want to talk to Ayanda Siboni now, who's Group Executive of Mutuality at the Professional Providence Society. And she's going to argue that protecting ethical professionals can no longer stop at simply praising their courage. Ayanda, a very warm welcome and a very apt conversation in the current South African climate. I guess we should ask why anyone should expose corruption if doing so could cost them their career and in some cases, as we well know, even their life.
Thank you for having me, Jeremy. Corruption in this country is a societal issue because it is something that, if not put under control, can break the foundations of the country. So it is all our business, professionals and general society, to make sure that corruption does not thrive, doesn't have a place to grow.
But we might have reached the point, Ayanda, and one hopes not, where we're at a point where silence is becoming the rational choice for professionals, given the risks that we've outlined.
It cannot be the choice because we cannot afford that. So where professionals become under threat and that kind of culture breeds, we need a society to speak up and fight this corruption and also protect whistleblowers. I think there's room for us to create legislation. The bill is there. We need to enact it into a law to protect whistleblowers so that people know that they've got the protection should they need it when they speak up.
Who do you think is failing in that respect when we talk about whistleblowers? Is it employers themselves? Is it law enforcement or the state, or perhaps a combination of all of that?
I think it's a combination of all these things, and it's also the lack of conversation around it. It's a lack of coordination between the professions, between the employers as well as the state. So it's a combination of all of these things, and it's going to take all of us to work together in order to solve it.
How do you think coordination then in that respect can be improved?
Coordination, I guess the first, which is what I've already mentioned, is around the bill that needs to be enacted into law. It's creating the structures and also just making sure that where there is corruption and it is exposed, there are consequences that are seen, because people become brazen when they know that they can get away with the corruption that is out there. And in fact, this is now getting to a point where when we look at our graduate professional index and the concerns that professionals have got, people are becoming scared to speak up because they don't feel like they've got the right protections when they do speak up. In construction, for example, it's become very dangerous for engineers to work in their jobs because of the mafia that's there, the extortion that happens. But if that is spoken about and people who do it get caught and arrested and there's visibility of the consequences, it will become less common.
There is an effort to improve current legislation, as you have already referenced, but existing whistleblower protection, do you think it's fundamentally inadequate, or is the bigger problem that existing protections such as they are simply not enforced?
I would dare say that they're probably not enforced adequately. In South Africa, we don't struggle with creating legislation, I guess, but we don't enforce them as effectively. And as we've seen in the public discourse, there are many places where there has been failure. But if we were to focus on enforcement and making sure that the enforcement is strong, we will be in a better position.
So you call for security. You also talk about relocation and threat assessment. Who decides then within an organization when a threat is serious enough to justify that level of protection?
Well, within organizations, I think there are enough governance structures, where there is risk that's associated. I wouldn't propose that other external factors or the state get involved within organizations. I think there are sufficient controls, whether it's the management or the board or the security areas within a company. But that needs to be taken seriously. And where people feel threatened, it needs to be taken with a level of urgency so that they know that they can carry out their jobs and get the protection that they need.
And Ayanda, if that level of urgency is not applied, what tends to happen, I think, and maybe is already happening, is is that our skills base simply starts to diminish as young engineers, as you've referenced, finance professionals conclude that challenging corruption simply isn't worth the risk. So there's a real negative domino impact there, isn't there?
There's a huge impact. In fact, referencing the same graduate professional index, we started to see that young professionals are starting to have different preferences in terms of where they work. So the state is becoming less attractive as an employer because of the perception that it can become a lot more riskier when you are enforcing and working in the state type of space, as well as people choosing to then go work outside of South Africa, which then drains the skills in the country that are so desperately needed.
What do you think needs to change then for you to tell a young professional today with confidence that speaking up is still the right thing to do, given all the constraints that we've discussed?
Consequences need to be public. People need to see that if you do the wrong thing, if you're involved in corruption, there will be consequences. You cannot have people that are intimidating others, people that are paying bribes, carry on living their lives as if nothing has happened. So I think the consequences definitely need to be there. And we need to have this kind of conversation more publicly. We need to have more people speaking up against it in leadership in the political space, leadership in business, leadership in civil society needs to speak up against it. And we need to see more results of people getting consequences.
But the trouble is that conversation that you refer to is either not happening enough or is just happening sporadically and maybe within the wrong spheres.
And this is the start of that conversation. People like yourselves in the media, we really need a strong media voice that exposes the kind of corruption. And South African media has done well in doing that, but we need the consistent voice to be there.
Ayanda Seboni, thank you very much indeed. You're the Group Executive of Mutuality at the Professional Provident Society. I do appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Moneyweb at midday for all your up-to-date stories.
Now, South Africa spends enormous energy, I would contend, trying to get small businesses into corporate and government supply chains, all well and good. But winning the contract can sometimes be the beginning of a big problem. What am I talking about? Well, long payment terms, expensive working capital and procurement systems designed around big incumbents, and that can leave an SME growing on paper while running out of cash. It's a real conundrum for many companies in South Africa. Janice Johnston is with me now, Chief Executive Officer of Edge Growth Ventures. It's an impact investing fund manager specifically for SMEs. And you're about to hear that she'll argue the real failure is not intention, but the way in which supplier development is designed. Janice, welcome to the program. So is the thesis here that big companies can bankrupt some of the SMEs they claim to be developing?
Thank you, Jeremy, for having us or having me on your show. So I think what we're sort of outlining is that there is a lot of good intention at the executive level to support SMEs, but as that intention trickles down the organization, there are various sort of disconnection points, which first of all make it very difficult for the SMEs to actually get part of that corporate supply chain, given that often this is not part of the procurement manager's scorecard. So they have different priorities in terms of how they're allocating their business to different suppliers, which can make it incredibly difficult and often not enabling them to have a fair shot versus the incumbent. And then very much following on the point that you made at the beginning in terms of funding, and that sometimes when they are successful, we are finding that the types of repayment terms and the requirements on the SMEs are absolutely crippling for them to manage cost of capital effectively. And sometimes we are seeing that their funding requirement or working capital cycle can be in excess of 90 and 120 days, where their cost of capital is so much higher than the corporates. So even from a macroeconomic perspective, that just seems very inefficient from an economy.
Janice, I want to come back to payment in just a moment, but let's just return to procurement for a second if we can. It's a difficult one because often some of the bigger organizations and particularly state-owned entities have got their own governance protocols to follow in that respect. So they're not necessarily doing anything wrong. It's just that they've got to watch their own internal mechanisms, right?
Absolutely. And we do understand the preference for known quantities, for companies that have the ability to absorb shocks that can happen. So that speaks to sort of bigger suppliers. However, we really do believe that there is certainly a small segment. We certainly wouldn't expect the entire supply chain to be converted to SMEs, but there are portions where the companies do actually meet the requirements. They do meet the quality control that is needed and go through extensive governance procedures, and still it's slow, and there's a risk or a lack of risk appetite to bring them on board.
How do you speed up the payment process? If, as you say, an SME has to wait 90 or 120 days, it might realistically ask itself why it should effectively finance the working capital of a much bigger company. But again, a difficult process, I imagine, to streamline.
It is very difficult. From a public sector perspective, there is actually a legal requirement for government to pay SMEs within 30 days. So there's the legislative environment. It's just not happening in practice. And I think this is borne out by some of the National Treasury figures. So it's not just our experience that we're talking to. So that's certainly something that one would hope they could alleviate quite quickly if that were implemented correctly. And then I think on the private sector side, there are various options to try. First, there are some corporates that do enable guarantees or leveraging of their balance sheets, but invariably those are only at invoice stage. They do not want to take the execution risk that the SME has. So there's a need for more purchase order financing, which is effectively for the SME to get the funding in order to be able to source and select the cost of sales. And there are a few sort of dynamic or blended finance initiatives that we would suggest get explored further that doesn't carry the same kind of cost structure that current options that are available at the moment sort of provide. So where they just tend to be very expensive. And so we would want to see how we could de-risk and mitigate with some help of the corporates.
There is, of course, the argument that goes against every governance protocol is that companies should just pay a little bit more or accept more risk to bring smaller suppliers into the chain. But that's hardly likely to happen.
Well, I mean, it's unlikely to happen in the current thinking of quite siloed, definitive performance metrics that are in place now. But we would challenge a lot of the corporates with the intention that they're saying at the ExCo level that if they apply a slightly more systemic view to this and what the growth in the SME sector will do more broadly in terms of job creation, expansion of consumer base, and a whole lot of other positive socioeconomic benefits, that at least a portion of their supply chain could be dedicated to this sector.
You also argue that broad-based black economic empowerment can sometimes create difficult or awkward incentives. Have we reached a point where supplier development has become too focused on just getting points rather than building a viable business?
So I think that sometimes does become the case. Obviously, there's a range within the corporate segment in terms of how they interpret this. The BE legislation, I think, whilst it has been very catalytic in some respects, and we would, see that as a real positive. It's just that some of the very binding thresholds that haven't actually been increased over the years, like the revenue cap, etc., can sometimes have limiting effects on SMEs, sort of incentives to grow well beyond that.
Janice Johnston, thank you very much indeed. You're the Chief Executive Officer of Edge Growth Ventures. Appreciate your time. Thank you. And that's where we are going to leave it for today. You've been listening to Moneyweb at midday. We're here every weekday at noon with the latest in current affairs, the economy and policy. You can always catch the podcast version a little later. Thank you for making us part of your day. Until next time, goodbye.
Listen to the daily live stream of Moneyweb at midday or download episodes on moneyweb.co.za, the Moneyweb app, Apple Podcasts and Spotify, or follow Moneyweb News on social media for more updates. Moneyweb, your trusted source for business and investment insights.